Hi all. Let's wait just a moment for people to gather. Hi everyone. We're very excited to have you here today, and we'll spend the next hour discussing digital therapeutics. I'm Dean Andrews. I'm a board member of HealthTech Build. Before we begin, I'd like to take a minute to give you some background on our organization. We're a mission-driven nonprofit, and we're focused on accelerating digital technology in life sciences and in healthcare. We host many events, currently virtually and hopefully soon in person again. We've been very fortunate to have leading organizations participate. To learn more, go to our website, healthtechbuild.com. We're always looking for new sponsors. That's how we make these events happen. If you're interested, please reach out to us via the website. We have a great panel today, and I wanted to thank our speakers, our moderator, Laura Lovett of Moby Health News, and I want to thank our sponsor, MedAcuity, where I work as Director of Business Development. If you have any questions, please use the chat function. We'll try to answer as many of them as we can. With that, I'll hand it over to Laura.
Thanks, Dean. I'm so excited to talk about digital therapeutics today with our panel. And I would first like to have everyone go around and introduce themselves. So I'd love to start with Karen. Could you talk to us a little bit about your role?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Donahue from Human Logic. I'm a product designer, and I have designed early releases for 4 digital therapeutics platforms, including CBT, behavior modification for alcohol consumption, eating disorders, and I'm also currently advising on the design of new products, including one for screening for depression, and also one that's doing continuous monitoring of patient biomarkers. My goals in designing these products include building trust through the user experience, data accuracy, and improving ways to monitor and measure health outcomes.
Great, so happy that you're on this. David, could you tell us a little bit about your role?
Sure, thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm David Zuckerman. I am Digital Health Partnerships Lead at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Started this role in May of 2020 with the goal of finding the best-in-class digital health, digital therapeutics partners to bring in and partner with. So Takeda's a 240-year-old pharmaceutical company based in Tokyo, Japan. There's about 50,000 employees worldwide and about 20,000 in the US. And their therapeutic areas of focus are in oncology, rare disease, GI, plasma-derived therapeutics or therapies, and neuroscience. And prior to Takeda, I spent about 6 years at 2 different startups in the Boston area, one called the Learning Corp that has a digital therapeutic called Constant Therapy. And prior to that, I was with Pear Therapeutics for about the first 4 years of Pear's existence. So really happy to be here.
Great. And Ben, I'd like to hear a little bit about your role too.
Hi, everyone. I'm Benjamin. Happy to be there. Thank you for having me for this discussion. So I'm heading strategic marketing at Voluntis. Voluntis, an Aptar Pharma company. Historically, Voluntis is a company that has pioneered the field of digital therapeutics with more than 20 years of experience. So we are developing digital therapeutics to empower patients who are suffering from cancer and from chronic disease mostly. We're also investigating a lot of the other therapeutic areas and other needs. And as a strategic marketing manager at Voluntis, I'm looking at new opportunities, steering the strategy of the company in new directions with new partnerships with complementary technologies, synergistic technologies, with at heart solving patients' needs and facilitating the interaction between patients and HCPs. And prior to that, I've been working in a consulting company specialized in innovation and life sciences. And with this experience, I worked a lot with large groups, pharmaceutical, medtech groups, especially on digital innovation.
Great. Well, I'm so excited for this group to be here and have such a diversity in experiences coming to the table today. I'd love to kick off with sort of that overarching question. What distinguishes digital therapeutics from mainstream digital health and well-being market? And, does it matter? What's that criteria? Karen, maybe we could start with you.
So looking at the use cases for digital therapeutics, they are digital solutions that improve patient health outcomes. And they typically include user experiences that encourage patient behavior, like lifestyle changes. So for example, monitoring use cases, behavior change use cases, preventative use cases that help patients avoid serious conditions. And so they're distinct from wellness apps in that digital therapeutic solutions have to require clinical evidence that they substantiate intended use in treatment, that they actually cause better patient outcomes. And I think Benjamin had a comment on that. He wanted to.
Yeah, to complete that, so there is, on the strictly speaking, digital therapeutics definition, there has been a huge work in the last 5 to 6 years with the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, who guided somehow the elaboration of some standards for the industry with an official definition of DTX. And as you said, Karen, the clinical evidence is key. The regulatory compliance and approval is, of course, key. And to me, I would also add to that the integration of healthcare professionals, either through the prescription or through the recommendation or through giving access to the solution to patients in their pathway. To me, that makes them different from wellness apps, which have a different role to play in the digital ecosystem for health and wellness.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even as a journalist, it seems to have evolved every year. There were different definitions, and now it seems like they're becoming more industry standards for what the definition is, which is really interesting as the space grows and sort of matures. David, did you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think Ben, you hit this quite well. In having clinical trials that really speak to sort of accepted or provable endpoints is key, and really that can serve as a basis for a regulatory submission. And going through the regulatory approval process, having a prescription sort of pathway that's defined in reimbursement and coverage. Yeah, I think those are really the key criteria that distinguish it from just a health or wellness app.
Great. And kind of going off of that, I know that a lot of prescription digital therapeutics are paired with medications. Not always, but sometimes. What are the challenges in terms of usability there, and how is safety and efficacy being navigated? Maybe we'll kick it off with you, David. I know you have a lot of experience in that, especially working with life science.
Sure. So in terms of challenges, yeah, I mean, they're really compounded by designing the clinical trial that compares to either standard of care or potentially a sham app, which will be accepted by the FDA. And assuming there is approval, challenges in prescription and prescribing a drug, as well as software at the same time or separately. In terms of reimbursement coverage, is it individually for combination products? I mean, these are really key challenges that need to be sort of addressed along the way. Who steps in to help onboard the patient and the HCP to these products? Who are the true prescribers with prescribing capability that are in the picture? Is there pharmacists in the picture, or nursing support from a hub or patient services? And then really, Karen is an expert in the field, but who's really going to drive adherence and thinking about usability? Who's really going to drive this to either the drug or the software? So, yeah, I think those are sort of key challenges that will arise along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting because each of you has a different perspective that you're coming from. But, Ben, in terms of this question, in terms of startups and in terms of that industry lens, what are you looking at as challenges?
I think something that surprised me when I joined the industry at Volunteers, for example, is the importance, the level of importance that's put into clinical development when you are developing a digital therapeutics. You are talking about efficacy and safety. We are talking about digital health interventions on which we have, I would say, a limited retrospective. I mean, it's fairly new. The industry has been growing, so the experience we have on how to design clinical trial to demonstrate the real efficacy in real-world setting of this digital solution is not clear. It wasn't clear a few years ago, and that's by especially working with pharmaceutical companies, indeed, that we can progress in that direction and elaborate digital endpoints for these trials, specific outcomes that are adapted depending on the disease, depending on the patient profile, etc. So that's clearly moving forward, that's moving fast. And I didn't check the publication because it was too recent, but there is a company, Kaya Health, who published a paper, for example, where they tested the safety of their digital therapeutics in the field of musculoskeletal disorders, low back pain, I think, on more than 140,000 patients, I think. So you can see that even at this, for DTX company, we are trying to push forward the concept of bringing clinical excellence at all levels through scaling things up, I would say. But this requires a lot of theoretical work by building the right design for the trials and so on. Pretty much like a pharma or medical device company, actually.
Yeah, and Karen, I'd love to hear your perspective from that. You know, how does that affect patients as the end users? What does that look like for them, and what needs to be kept top of mind when you're kind of having these combination therapies?
Sure. Well, as David mentioned, there are multiple personas often in these kinds of environments. So we see similar personas in digital therapeutics as in typical corporate enterprise use cases. So you'll have persona for the end user, but you may also have a persona for a clinician or an IT admin or even a patient advocate. So these are challenging and complex use cases and environments. And often in the case where there's a need for a patient to be onboarding, you have what I call reluctant IT admins who are healthcare practitioners. You know, they're not trained to do that. They're not necessarily want to do it, but it's part of the requirement in deploying that solution. So that is a challenge.
Yeah, I'd love to move on to talking a little bit about validation. You know, where are we in terms of data to support that these technologies actually work? Karen, do you want to start us off with that?
Well, one of the things is you really have to understand what are the metrics of success in this particular kind of deployment. And really, digital therapeutics are a consumer service at the end of the day. And so you have to monitor and treat them that way. From a product perspective, you know, you have to think about your user experience metrics like you would with any other digital business. So adoption, onboarding, you know, the ability to retain users and keep them engaged. So churn, for example, is something that you want to watch. And looking at the data to support those kinds of monitoring and decisioning is on how you adapt your product as it's in the market are all critical.
David, what are you thinking about in terms of that data, especially coming from the life sciences?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you know, looking at some, you know, newly public companies that have gone public via IPO or via SPAC, I mean, we will get a look under the hood of some of these companies to see, you know, the data that's going to support whether or not they're working. And I think we'll be able to see trends quarter to quarter when these get, you know, earnings get released, and we'll be able to see sort of user acquisition and potentially churn, like Karen mentioned. It's going to be really interesting to see, you know, as more and more companies go public via whatever method, a true look under the hood at some of these numbers. And it's hard to say on some of the private companies. You know, I think we're able to see in some great reporting numbers of prescriptions or number of, not prescriptions, but number of users. And how we can sort of track that over time and see them trend up or down. Be really interesting to see.
Yeah, Ben, do you have anything to add, especially coming from industry?
No, I think I fully concur to what Karen and David have been mentioning. I think that we'll see more and more evidence of this working. To me, we have a kind of not scaling issue, but a scaling questions, because we are now progressively transitioning from an environment which is driven by clinical research and building evidence in a very specific environments. When we want to push things at scale on different markets, generally globally, we are talking about digital businesses. So pretty quickly in the storytelling, there is a global story to tell about these solutions. Things get more complicated because the market access channels are not the same. The willingness from prescribers, for example, to use these kind of solutions may not be the same. The expectation from the patient may not be the same. The regulatory status of the solution may not be the same. So for all these reasons, scaling things up in digital therapeutics, even if it's digital and you can say, okay, it's an app, it's more complicated than it looks like. And that's why also I think it takes somehow more time than we may have expected 10 years ago to really scale things up. But I think we're progressively getting there.
Yeah, and in terms of data, one thing I wanted to ask about was usability. How is that being measured right now? How do we know what's going on in terms of that end user? Do you want to start us off, Karen? I know this.
Sure. Well, one thing is that you really have to take a step back and understand your personas and understand their motivations and needs and how they're unique from each other. And so once you understand that, you can look at the product journey for each persona. So an end user patient may have a very different product journey than a clinician who's actually monitoring or managing the patient's experience. So understanding what those journeys are, and then through the processes of those journeys, understanding what can go right and what can go wrong. That's what you have to look at in terms of usability. So you have patients that may not be onboarding correctly and then fail to actually get through some of the early success metrics of user engagement. That's a product issue. And so those are things that you need to understand when you're designing these kinds of solutions. You have to do it by persona. You have to really understand that unique persona. That persona may have unique technical requirements, technical environment. I've seen examples where there have been assumptions made about the product where users will have a smartphone, when in fact, maybe the target users don't have a smartphone, right? So that's an example.
Yeah, would anyone else like to chime in on what they're thinking about for usability?
Sure. I just a quick sort of anecdote. I was lucky enough to be part of some early pilot studies with digital therapeutics products and was able to sit with clinicians, sit with patients and watch them use sort of early versions of our product. And the importance of fitting into the HCP workflow was just cannot be overstated. You know, we had shown our HCPs our dashboard that had, you know, charts and graphs and color coded and all sorts of fancy things on it that really gave them a view into what the patient was doing sort of on their mobile phone in real time. But, you know, sitting with these clinicians, you really understand that they did not have a lot of time in between patients, didn't have the time to go see the fancy dashboards that we had built, and really asked for a much simplified, sort of scaled down, show me what I need to know approach. And it can't be overstated how little time and how simplified and just to the point a lot of that data needs to be. So in terms of usability, just huge lessons learned sitting and watching, you know, HCPs or patients interact with the early versions of the product.
Can I add one thing, which is, you know, there's an assumption made there that for a particular persona that they want to see a lot of data, that they want a user experience that's a lot of stuff on the screen. And in my experience, in particular, looking at use cases where the user is overwhelmed with so much data, IT admins, for example, I think of it that we're really trying to get to a peace of mind use case. So in other words, that it's really only when the user needs to be aware that there's something that needs to be done, not spending time looking at a screen full of data, but in fact, only being directed either through a notification, maybe on a device or some other. It is the notification to look that there's something important. So I call that peace of mind, you know, use case as part of monitoring. And it's sometimes it's contrarian to the way that product teams think. They think more data means more stuff on the screen and users' eyes on the screen. That may not be the success metric. The success metric is perhaps peace of mind for the user, or even for the end user, you know, no false positives, only being notified when something is really important and has to be done.
Yeah, fully concur to that. And I've been looking at some research also, because this is always a question when you're developing something for patients who are suffering from a specific condition, and you say, okay, they may have some anxiety with their symptoms or the disease evolution. So every time we can get an information to them, we should give that to them, because, you know, the therapies, they need it, etc. And when you look at things and publications, again, you can see that, for example, push notifications and pop-ups on the smartphones are perceived very differently than on demand. Like, you go to the application, you go to the solution, and if you have something to say, if you have a symptom to declare or to report, then you can use it. And as you stated, Karen, it only pops up when it's really serious and you should contact your emergency care center, for example. But otherwise, if you really want to empower the patient, then it's the patient who decides most of the time when there is a need to report an information or not, for example. And that goes to me into usability.
And you have to keep in mind too, in my experience, especially designing I was working on a PTSD platform, that the end users are themselves under stress, and they are not your typical, users who are perhaps more calm, right? So they're under stress. And I think some product teams, in particular engineering driven ones, they think more data, more notifications, more stuff is better. And you have, from a design perspective, from a user experience perspective, you have to step back and say, what is in the best interest of the user to be able to drive that therapeutic behavior that you want in your solution?
Yeah, and I think, this conversation is sort of touching on this, but what are those main obstacles to adoption? Maybe Ben, do you want to start us off with this?
Yeah, and maybe one way of seeing this, we've been looking, especially in Europe, because I'm located in France, and I've been looking more carefully at the European market. And for the last 18 months, we talked a lot about what happened in Germany, where there's been this framework about approval and reimbursement of digital solutions. Some of them are qualified as DTX, not all of them, but some of them are. And the idea for this process was to say, okay, through the public policy, you can have some kind of temporary period where the product will be reimbursed, the time for you as a startup to generate some evidence of impact, either clinical or medical economic impact or both. So you would expect, at the time I was looking at this, so 2 years and a half ago, business models and payment was a big question about digital therapeutics, who would pay for that and why, etc. So you would say, okay, with this framework, as somebody pays for it, we shall see a huge adoption by providers and patients of these solutions. It will be a blast. And if you look at numbers, it's not that it's disappointing, it's that you see that the adoption is slower than expected. And to me, that's different reason. There is a first reason, as you said, David, time is essential for healthcare providers. And for the moment, giving them access to the dashboard, even if the patient doesn't pay for the solution, they don't have a lot of incentive to use these dashboards and spend time looking at this, that they would be better spending more time with their patients and doing consultations. One, because that's what they want to do, and two, because that's what they're paid to do for. Another thing to me is also training. I like your idea of reluctant IT guy for healthcare professionals. I think it's maybe early adopters are really comfortable with prescribing and forwarding these solutions, but most of prescribers and most of healthcare professionals who have to grasp this solution just don't know how to do it. They're not necessarily sufficiently trained. And you would imagine, again, because it's digital and it's an app, it would be nimble and you just click and it's gone. But we all know it's not the case because we all face technical issues with solutions that are far simpler than the digital therapeutics. So I think this is also not a barrier to adoption, but a point to consider for the coming years to say, okay, let's support not only the patient in using the solutions, but training also the one who will be involved in the pathway to make sure it's smooth all along the way.
Yeah, does anyone have anything they'd like to add to that about obstacles?
There are other technical obstacles in that if your solution requires on the orchestration of notifications to get the user to change their behavior, hey, how many drinks did you have today? How big were the drinks? Or did you do your CBT exercise or whatever it is? The user can, in most smartphone conditions, actually turn off notifications, right? So you have a situation where your solution requires on the user being part of this orchestrated experience, and the user has control over that on their device, unless it's a dedicated device that you've custom designed that the user might be wearing or it might be implanted. So there are these sort of technical challenges as well that you have to consider.
Kind of going off of this, we're not seeing huge adoption by doctors prescribing these tools. Why aren't they prescribing them yet? What are sort of the obstacles there? Karen, do you want to start with that one?
Well, one is perhaps in their product journey, the discovery part, maybe they don't know or they don't have time to be educated about what the opportunities are. So, the doctor's journey has itself a point where they have to either discover the product because someone has told them about it or it's been referred to them. And then they have to actually go through their own assessment. They sort of have a kind of buyer persona. So they're maybe making a buy, no buy decision, or as part of a team, making a buy, no buy decision. And, maybe setting that up and doing that is too technical. I mean, a lot of the doctors that I've dealt with in my design work, they are not techies, a few, right? But not typically technical people. And so they're not engineers, and they're not going to debug anything to try to onboard and start utilizing it. It's a consumer, like I want to stress, it's a consumer quality experience. The expectations of that, it needs to be a consumer experience in order to be more adopted.
Yeah, David, do you have anything to add to that, especially where, pharma companies do work with doctors and getting, different molecules in their hands? What does it look like? What's the difference?
Yeah, so just in terms of the digital products, Karen, I think you hit this right on the head in that, there may be a discovery thing. There still is a lot of education to be needed and to be had. It's possible that, the provider organization hasn't approved the product, the technical hurdles of, putting this or allowing access to a system. That dashboard that we were talking about earlier, perhaps is outside of the EMR, their regular workflow. So asking them to sort of leave a system and log into something else to view a dashboard or whatever the case is, just a lot of hurdles there. So I think you got those nicely, Karen.
I recently had to be asked to assess a product where there was an assumption made that doctors would be able to tap a screen, but they were wearing gloves because they were in sterile settings. So that's an example where you need to think through that whole journey and the conditions and the environment that the user is in when they're using the product.
Yeah. And Ben, how are you thinking about it in terms of, coming from the industry perspective, looking at how do you get this into the hands of doctors, and what conversations are going on there? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, it had to happen. So I think one point also is that doctors may not necessarily know that these things exist. Again, it's to me, it's young, so it's not only for early adopters, but it's hard to communicate at scale on this. When they know there are digital therapeutics that could potentially help their patients, they may not know where to look for, where to find some information about them. They may want to find something structured, with a kind of labeling, something that proves that, okay, there is a kind of stamp to say this is something which has demonstrated clinical evidence, this is how it helps patients, etc. And even at a country level, I know in France, in Germany, in the UK, in the US also, there is a huge effort that are made to kind of standardize how we can consider all these things that are pretty differently. If you deep dive into the DTX field, you can see a lot of solutions. Some are only software, some they are hardware, some are based on virtual reality, some are based on artificial intelligence, etc., etc. And all those concepts for a healthcare practitioner are completely new. As you said, Karen, they are not techies. So you just don't know how to handle this. And then for the workflow, I fully agree with that. I mean, the time, as I said, is of the essence. And whenever you try to change something in the workflow of the clinician, it leads to loss of time somewhere. So that's where I think they are a bit scared because digital is not there to add a layer of complexity in a job that is already pretty stimulating, I would say. So they are very cautious around that. So when we discuss with clinicians, we have to kind of defend the case of time saving, efficiency, and seamless impact on the workflow. And again, as I said before, training.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about startups and life sciences. So, digital health startups are increasingly working with life science companies. But one of the big questions for life science companies is that buy versus build. What are the pros and cons to each? David, could you start us off with this?
Sure, happy to. So there's really a number of factors to be considered. And from the pharma side, I mean, do they have the team to be able to, design and test and iterate and build and potentially commercialize a digital product? I mean, many pharmacos are grounded in R&D around molecules. And so it's not necessarily a skill set or, an ability that the existing employees have. And so I think that's a really big factor for sort of looking externally and potentially partnering or buying. And, other factors are the time it takes to do this. Is this a product that you're looking to get on the market as quickly as you can, or is this something that's further back in the pipeline that you actually have time to do the work versus partner? Other thoughts are around scalability. So, does the org have the ability to sort of scale these products across geographies? Thinking about this from a regulatory perspective, a lot of digital therapeutics companies are sort of built on platforms with quality management and all that regulatory from country to country in mind. Not necessarily something that pharma has from a software perspective, I guess. Maybe funding and commitment to building a team to do this. So is there, commitment that there will be funds to build a software or product sort of driven organization within the pharmas? I think that's a big one. It's obviously more costly upfront to build, or to partner, but sort of thinking about this long term, does the pharma company have the willingness and the commitment and the understanding to maintain a software product over time, with product and engineering teams and designers? It's not necessarily in pharma's existing skill set, some of them anyway. So I think those are some pretty big factors to consider when you're sort of doing the build versus buy math.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
I just have one comment, having been through a couple of these integrations after acquisition, is that one of the things that might not be immediately apparent is that for product teams, one of the first people you have to convince is not necessarily the product team inside the pharma, but the IT security team, right? So the IT security team can be your first barrier to being seen as a vendor or an acceptable solution. So I would prioritize the security model for your product and your ability to satisfy those requirements as you're looking to sell and partner into big orgs.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's obviously a lot of pro cons to this, but even what are the key capabilities and constraints in building digital therapeutics partnerships, whether it's with life science companies or if it's, with health systems? Ben, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest questions, and where the DTX/pharma partnerships, for example, have been progressing over time, is just the definition of the problem you want to solve. Because sometimes you can spend a huge deal of time on, okay, we want to build a digital solution like this with this kind of features because patients have this kind of needs, etc. And just aligning between the DTX and the pharma structure, the expectations, and what are the specs and I would call the target product profile, to use the pharma semantics. Just solving this is already quite complex. And I think another challenge that I see is that structurally the DTX companies and the pharma companies are not the same structure at all in terms of organization and in terms of products they develop. So I kind of discovered that by jumping into the industry, but we talk a lot about agility in the software development, etc., iterative development life cycles, and so on. In pharma, from what I know about pharma, I mean, working side by side with them, you spend a huge deal of time again developing the product, but once the product is there, it's kind of settled. So the cycles are not the same at all. So when you're asking a pharmaceutical company to work in an iterative fashion through agility, etc., to develop the product and maybe launch an MVP or launch a beta version of something to get some feedback, that's not the way pharma is used to work. And the timelines are not the same between the two types of structures also. So to me, that's where we think the two types of structures have been learning to work together. We continue to learn. But I think that's what history tells us, is that the way of functioning have been pretty different historically.
Yeah, would anyone like to add to that one?
Sure. So I've been lucky enough to sort of be on both sides of the table around DTX and pharma partnerships. And, it's a big piece of this is clear alignment on expectations and understanding, like you said, Ben, of the timelines. And, timing in pharma is generally longer than, a day in the life of a startup. And, the number of stakeholders that are involved in decision-making in pharma, and especially around digital products, and trying to get the right people with the digital experience in terms of the procurement and the legal team and security and, and the privacy team and pharmacovigilance, the communications team, medical review, all of these folks need to be around the table. And it's not a fast or easy thing to do in a large, pharma organization. So I think that's, one of the big constraints. Also, there's timing, like you mentioned, Ben, in terms of business planning and sort of the annual planning process. And so while the solution may be a really great fit, it just might be off cycle from sort of the business planning and in the funding cycle. So I think, a lot not to get, dismayed or discouraged, but it just might be a little bit of misalignment in terms of timing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know part of this whole conversation is the regulatory landscape for digital therapeutics. Ben, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the landscape there? And maybe I know you work in the EU and also have some efforts in the US. Could you talk about what you're seeing?
Again, yeah. What I'm seeing, especially as you said in Europe, is more and more structuration on the pathways to put that on the market. I think again, when we were discussing about maybe even digital health a whole 10 years ago, regulatory landscape was generally a barrier because everybody was saying, okay, we just don't know how it will be regulated. We don't have any track record of developing products like this. So as we don't really know where we're heading, we prefer not heading anywhere, so that it's kind of cautious, to be cautious. Now it's not the case anymore. So in many countries, you have some pathways to build solutions and experiment it in real life settings. So the DIGA process that I mentioned earlier in Germany is a very good example of that. And even if the numbers may have been higher in an optimistic scenario, it had a huge impact on different countries. And then I attended some discussions, for example, where the idea is to say, okay, how can we replicate this model, which put the path forward for all these solutions at the European level, for example, on a country by country basis, and then on the European level. Of course, there are a lot of barriers to consider about pricing, about harmonization of standards, of these regulations, or technical ecosystem, because all the IT systems are not the same in all countries in Europe. So of course, it's not easy to imagine from one day to another, but this is the direction of the wind, and I think it's a positive way of seeing things, that regulation globally is consolidating its assets, and it helps DTX startups and companies to build their case with pharma, with hospitals, with other structures they need to partner with.
Would anyone like to add to that?
I just have one thing to add as a product designer. The pace of technology outruns regulatory approval, right? But at the end of the day, humans don't evolve that quickly. And so we still have humans that have to use the products, and we have to design and think about prioritizing the way human users think as we design the solutions. And so that's something to always keep in mind.
Yeah, no, definitely really interesting. And I also want to remind our audiences that we do have an ask. You can ask through chat different questions to the speakers. So if you have any questions, you can start asking those and we will get to them in a few minutes. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about risk. In terms of digital therapeutics, how can teams reduce risk for patients? Karen, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I'm going to take the human-computer interaction point of view, of course, which is, I think that teams should always assume that their target user definitions, or we call them personas, are actually just hypotheses until they've been validated with interviews with real target users. Really, really digging in, take the time to do it. Do not skip over this step. I see teams try to accelerate it or skip over it, but digital therapeutic use cases often serve like multiple personas. As we said, there could be an end user, patient, a doctor, a nurse, or a patient advocate. You have to really understand their unique needs, of their pain points, and what are their underlying motivations? What are their technical profiles? Do they have a smartphone? If they don't have a smartphone, what are they using? Do they like using a smartphone? If your patients are elderly people who've had some sort of a medical crisis, are they going to have the peace of mind to be able to use a device in order to utilize your solution? Things like that. Are they in conditions where low connectivity could affect their ability to use the product? So you need to think about the unique journeys for each persona, and then you want to remove any points of friction in the product journey, especially things that happened early on. So one of the biggest areas I see is poor onboarding. Again, it's got to be a consumer quality experience. So poor onboarding can have a very strongly negative effect on downstream user engagement metrics. And so making sure that your product journeys are as very smooth and empowering is really a great way to reduce risk. And also continuously monitoring the usage, and even if you can, instrument the digital products so you can actually see what's going on with the user behavior.
Yeah, and would anyone like to add to that in terms of risk? Shall we move on to some of our questions from the audience? We have quite a few. So one of the first ones is talking about unpacking 3 key stakeholders: patients, providers, and payers. Where do you see the most resistance to digital therapeutics, and where do you see the least resistance? Ben, do you want to try to take that one to kick us off?
Yeah, that's a complex one, ranking the 3 Ps in terms of reluctance to use digital therapeutics. I think the reluctance is not the reason for reluctance is not the same for all stakeholders. Patients, to me, is a question maybe of trust, as you stated, Karen. A lot of them may not be trusting their mobile device to input some data, or they don't trust a wearable to have on their arm to monitor passively some physiological data, etc. Physicians would be more, as I said, about time and efficiency. I don't want to lose time. I can't afford to lose time. And this thing, whatever it is, even if it's efficient, I have to change something in my way of doing things. So I have to change. I have to train myself, learn something new, either myself or the care team. So it will be translated again in time. And payers, I think it's, as you stated, evidence, even if it's growing, it's not always there. Paying for digital solutions, why not? But we need to provide some meat on the bone to say, okay, as a payer, you will find yourself incentivized using this DTX, paying for this DTX because of this and this and this. So I think the reasons are pretty different. I see still on the 3 items more traction than 5 years ago. It would be easy to say that COVID-19 plays a role in that. I think it plays a role, but it's not only because or thanks to COVID-19 that it's happening. But honestly, I think it's very difficult to rank saying, okay, 10% of patients are reluctant versus 50 of physicians, etc. I don't think there is a clear-cut answer on this one.
Any other thoughts on that?
I agree. I'm kind of thinking nowadays, you want to maybe launch your product and sort of get an early adoption with people who have a potential or they are open to the idea of wearing a monitor or using a device, or they have good attitude about it. So their affect and attitude is positive. They will be your early adopters, and maybe targeting them first, and then looking at how you can design a broader solution for the people who are less optimistic or have a more negative attitude towards using these kinds of solutions.
One other just quick thought that I read recently around sort of the payer perspective, and this is just from what I was reading recently, which is, a lot of these products are still sort of additive or in addition to standard of care or whatever the current treatment paradigm is, as opposed to replacing anything. So I think some of the reluctance was around adding, adding something else to pay for, as opposed to replacing anything. And, the importance of showing those long-term economic benefits is just really important. So maybe that's just one other thought around, what the payer's perspective is.
Great. We have another question for the panelists around, what do you see as the next big step change in the evolution of the digital therapeutics market and products? David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, great question. No, I really think, the sort of devices being worn remotely and the amount of data that's being collected, I really think it's in sort of the infrastructure to pull all of these disparate pieces of data together, and then having the artificial intelligence or the ability to sort of pull insights out of these huge data sets. That's really the next big key unlock, in my opinion. It's, we've been able to show and see that these many products are being used, whether prescription or not, in the amount of data that's being collected, the sort of next step is to really combine that with the patient's history or genetic data or other wearables data, the way that they're using a device, and the ability to draw insights out of all of these huge data sets. I really think that's sort of the next big hill and paradigm to sort of cross.
I agree. I do think understanding how these machine learning algorithms will help to facilitate the therapeutic process. But the challenge is that, these algorithms will also have biases, just like patients have biases. And so if you have a patient that's using a solution that's using machine learning, how do you, those algorithms are constantly changing, right? And I'm guessing at the time of FDA approval, they existed with a certain solution space, and then it's constantly changing. So in my mind, it's kind of a challenge. And also form factor, I think form factors can really play a role in our changing. I mean, I'm seeing interesting things in fabrics or things that are very, very small scale that can be utilized in ways that are unobtrusive. So those are kind of things that are on my mind for the next generation. But I am cautiously watching the machine learning part and trying to understand how does that impact the therapeutic experience.
Yeah, to add on that, I would say, as you stated, David, to integration, interoperability, because all the full gamut of digital health solutions that we can see here and there, there's DTX in one space, wearables, remote patient monitoring, telehealth, virtual care, etc. And all this progressively is starting to fit together. It's not easy, because it seems easy because we use the same words, but in real life setting, it gets complicated. And I think also one learning is maybe more, I'm not a big fan of the expression, but user centricity, and not user only as a patient, but user, as you stated, Karen, of all the personas that are evolving around this. It's sufficiently complex in terms of adoption as we discussed together. So we need really to make this as frictionless as possible for everyone, and not just for the patient, who is really at the heart of the question, for everyone, for pharma, for startups, etc. But all the people who are gravitating around, evolving around the patient, the caregivers, sometimes it's a relative, sometimes it's the mother, the father, the children, etc. All those persons should be taken into account. And I think it's also an evolution that we can see coming from the last years.
I just had a thought last night while I was preparing for the panel that, if you're a patient and you want to have a female OBGYN, for example, but in an environment where you're using machine learning algorithms, you won't be able to make that decision, right? So that's an example where the patient's point of view may not be part of the algorithms that are being used to deliver a solution. So it's something to think about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The next question is something I think about a lot, actually. It's talking about, most digital therapeutics are mobile based, but there are alternative modalities. So they could, such as video game consoles, laptops, TVs, and could that target increase different markets if you're using different modalities? So you're not just using the mobile phone. What could that do? Karen, do you want to start with that one?
Well, just because you have different modes and different devices doesn't necessarily mean it's going to improve the clinical outcome. So I would, again, wearing a skeptic's hat, I would be skeptical until it's proven that these additional modalities will add value. I think about it as like the path to value on any journey, whether it's the doctor, the patient, the other practitioner, the nurse, or the patient advocate, right? So they have to see value. And let's say I'm skeptical until I see that the value is there in order to make a decision.
It's interesting. Do you think engagement could change from, having a therapeutic on your laptop to on your phone? Do you think that would change that user experience at all?
It may positively change it, in part because when users want to be able to use these therapeutics on the go. So in other words, they need to be able to move and go outside. But today it's about 4 degrees Fahrenheit here in Toronto. So my mobile device that I have may not work. And I was recently interacting with a patient who recently had a pacemaker put in, and the device that this person has to use is very, very large. And and cumbersome and does not allow him to go outside easily. So you have to think about more devices and more parts of the user experience that are using these experimental devices may not be adding value. The important thing is to make sure it adds value to all users, and also it needs to prove therapeutic value.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
I know, but maybe just to add, the use cases are they are really leading the way. I mean, depending on the cases, you may need a smartphone or you may not need, depending on the cases, you will be web-based or not. And I think in some cases, maybe digital health is not even required. That we think that because it's digital, it should be there. Sometimes there's no need for digital solutions, and something in the real world would do pretty fine also. So it's always, again, trying really to spot on the problem you're trying to solve and making sure the solution you have in mind conceptually fits this problem or not. And not doing this because it's digital or because it's a trend, but because it actually meets some specific hurdle on the way and solve it.
Great. Well, this was such an interesting panel, and I feel like I could go on and on, but this was great, and I feel like I learned a lot. So thank you so much to our participants for coming on, and thank you for HealthTech Build for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you, HealthTech Build. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.